Okay, good morning. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jason Castile with Abel Solutions, and today we're going to be talking about ransomware, preparing and protecting your business. So first up, we'll go into what is ransomware, and a little bit on the history of ransomware, common attack vectors, and then finally prevention, detection, and remediation. So first, what is ransomware? In its simplest form, ransomware is malware that prevents access to a system or its files and demands that a ransom be paid in order to restore access. So over the time now, we've seen a lot of improvements and changes in how ransomware operates, but that's the one thing that has remained consistent. Sometimes the ransomware is money, but we're starting to see some changes in that as well. The history of ransomware. So the first known type of ransomware happened in 1989 and was known as the AIDS Trojan, also known as PS Cyborg. A Harvard-trained evolutionary biologist, Joseph L. Popp, had sent out 20,000 infected diskettes labeled AIDS Information Introductory Diskettes to attendees of the World Health Organization's International AIDS Conference. Once installed, the Trojan waited for their systems to be rebooted 90 times, then the Trojan hid directories and encrypted the names of files on the computer. To regain access, the users had to send $189 to PC Cyborg Corp at a post office box in Panama. Now, Dr. Popp was eventually caught, but he did not stand trial as he was found unfit. His attorney said that he had begun wearing a cardboard box on his head to protect himself from radiation. And one interesting side note to this was that Dr. Popp also included a note with all of his diskettes warning users that if they installed this diskette on their system, it could cause irreparable harm to their systems and its files, yet many users did it anyway. This is a good example of how, even back then, people didn't quite pay attention to what was put in front of them. In 2006, we saw the Archivus and GPC code Trojans. These are noteworthy because these were the first to use RSA encryption to lock files, which is something that has continued on today. By 2011, by quarter 3 in 2011, we had seen more than 60,000 ransomware infections at that point. By 2012, that number had jumped to over 200,000. And in 2013, we saw CryptoLocker, which could be considered the father of modern-day ransomware variants. It was the first to use RSA encryption and internet access to allow people to pay to have their decryption keys sent to them. And since then, we've seen quite a few evolutions of that same CryptoLocker methodology and lots of improvements to it. For instance, the original CryptoLocker, when infected, the users were notified immediately of the infection. This would give them the opportunity to potentially turn off their computer, disconnect it from the network, and do other things to limit the impact of it. But they soon evolved so that it wouldn't notify you until after it was complete, so that it had all of your files before it let you know what it was doing. They've also evolved by changing the breadth of their attack to include network drives, email files, database files, and online services such as Dropbox and Microsoft OneDrive. By 2016, the FBI estimated in quarter 1 alone, $209 million in ransomware fees had already been paid. So it's a pretty significant amount of money at this point. And one of the latest evolutions that we have seen with ransomware is ransomware as a service. These are basically services that any user can find online, go to, pay a small amount of money, right now currently $2,000 to $5,000, to have a custom ransomware payload designed for them. One of the interesting things about this is that they're providing these users a portal that they can use to manage their entire ransomware campaign, so they can see at a glance how many infections they've had, how many people have actually paid the ransom, and basically gauge the effectiveness of their overall campaign. This is a pretty strong sign of the big business that ransomware has become. So Next up, we'll talk about common attack vectors. Since the advent of modern ransomware, one of the things that's remained consistent is the use of social engineering to spread their payloads. So what is social engineering? As it relates to IT security, it's the psychological manipulation of people into performing actions or divulging confidential information. And why does social engineering work? It's because humans are very good at becoming comfortable in what they do and getting a routine and simply not paying attention to what they're doing to catch little details that might slip through. We see this a lot with some of the financial scams that are going around, and obviously this carries over to ransomware. One of the most common methods that we see these days are email phishing. So by disguising malicious content behind cleverly worded or sometimes not so cleverly worded subjects and attachments that try to trick users into opening documents that infect their systems. Oftentimes these documents contain links or malicious macros that will go out across the internet to retrieve their payload and then infect the user's system. Another method that we see less common than email phishing but still out there and growing is SMSing. So users will receive text messages that have instructions on how to contact them either via a URL or a phone number. Once they get someone on the phone, that person will pretend to be trying to help them with some problem and direct them to a website where they will launch the payload and infect their system that way. Another method is through social media. So everyone's on Facebook these days and various social sites. They will manage to get a story being linked by lots of users and hide malicious code in that. And if you see something coming from a friend or someone you know, someone you think you should trust, people very often will open a link and infect themselves that way. Another method is through instant messaging. And this one also ties into Facebook and other instant messaging clients. But the attackers will find a user on there, send them contact information, sometimes something that looks as simple and harmless as an image attachment, but will be linked out to a website containing the malicious code and infect their system. Some other methods that are a little more traditional but still in use these days, malvertising. So malicious content will be hidden in ads and banners on websites and getting the users to click them that way. This most commonly happens these days on adult sites and sometimes less common sites. Usually the more popular websites that people go to they'll have more trusted ad networks, but it's always good to pay attention to what you're clicking on, as always. Another common method is exploiting system vulnerabilities. We hear about this through news media all the time about how a new exploit has been found in Windows or through Chrome browsers, different things like that. These attackers are staying on top of this and trying to take advantage of these things as quickly as possible so that it won't be patched. So this is another good reason why you should always keep your systems up to date. Another method is through network propagation. So by infecting one system on a network, that system will go out and scan for vulnerabilities on other systems and spread files out to those systems and network shares and things like that in the hopes of getting users to click on those as well and infect even more systems. And lastly is through shared services such as Office 365, Dropbox, Google Drive. One of the common ways this happens is by allowing users access to these shared services from home systems, systems that may not be as secure as their office systems. They risk the potential of getting the malicious content out onto these shared services where other users may click those and infect their systems as well. So this is a good example of how having sound policies for accessing shared services is a good idea. And you should always be cautious and skeptical of anything that looks out of place. So next we're going to get into really the meat and potatoes of ransomware, and that's prevention, detection, and remediation. First up, prevention. So there is no real single solution to ransomware. It's evolved quickly and will continue to evolve, so having a layered approach is always good. First up, user awareness training. You always want to educate your users on the basics of detecting potentially malicious material. All it takes is for ransomware to end up on your systems is for one user to open an infected attachment. This could be as simple as an email called 2016 redundancy plans, spoofed from your HR director's email address, or something equally as unexpected yet realistic. Users must be aware of this risk and not led to open up email attachments that don't look legitimate to them. It's your first and ultimately best line of defense to educate users about how to do their jobs and what to expect, and also to not just kind of fly through their jobs daily in an effort to get things done. Another method for prevention is system updates and upgrades. So by keeping applications both up to date as far as updates go and upgraded for using the latest versions, it's a good way to avoid ransomware, because patches are being pushed out to address these things constantly, and newer software versions are really designed out of the box to be more secure. This isn't limited to just software applications on workstations and servers, but also all devices on your networks, printers, firewalls, routers, even these new Internet of Things devices such as refrigerators, which have Wi-Fi connectivity and run operating systems that can be exploited just as easily. So it's always good to know what's on your network, and that way you can have a clear idea of what needs to be updated and could potentially be a concern. Another good method for preventing this is email filtering. So numerous applications and hardware appliances and services on the market for this, but they act as a buffer between incoming email and your end users. So they will scan incoming emails before they're delivered to the user's mailbox and look for malicious content, attachments, links, and other things, and that way they can block those before the end user gets it and has a chance to actually execute that content. They also give you control over whitelisting different types of content, senders, and locations to find a good balance that works for you. Blocking locations if your business doesn't do business with things that come out of China. It might be a good thing to do to block emails coming from China. Most of these services actually give the end users or administrators the ability to monitor these things and release content that might be flagged by mistake. Another good option is DNS filtering. So these services work similarly to email filtering, but they work more on an internet-wide basis. So they will look at the locations that users are going to access on the internet, so going to websites and other services that they might be accessing, and block content that way. So even if an attachment were to make it through to a user's mailbox, if they open that attachment and the macro tried to go out to a website, it would monitor that connection and block the connection before they were actually able to make the connection and download that malicious payload. Most of these services also offer content filtering combined with them, so they do have some added benefits. So you can actually block the types of websites that users are able to go to in general. So if you don't want users visiting shopping websites, you can block those. Not that those are particularly known for malicious content, but it's a good way to just know what your users are able to do and sometimes keep them on task. Another option is traditional antivirus software, and this is one area that they've struggled with ransomware because of the speed at which these things have evolved, but we're starting to see some changes there as well. Traditionally, antivirus software has worked on more of a file basis, so they will monitor individual files and changes to those files in an effort to catch things. We're starting to see changes there that they're operating more on a behavior based. So rather than looking at just files, they're actually looking at processes on the system and watching what those processes are doing. So if it sees an unknown process or an unfamiliar process and sees that it's accessing lots of files, potentially encrypting files, then it can terminate those processes and alert administrators and the user. This type of change is really the future of antivirus software in general, and getting more into behavior analysis. Another option available for users of Windows-based networks is group policy and app blocker. Group policy allows you to set limitations on what the users can do, what they can access on their system, and just in general the rights they have. This kind of ties back into giving users administrative rights on the system, but goes further than that. You can control where the users can go on the system, And then using something like AppLocker, which is an extension of group policy, you can control specifically the applications you want them to run and limit it to only those applications. So you define a list of applications. And you can also even go as far as to locking down where those applications have the ability to write on the system. So you can limit them to a specific folder or a couple of folders on the system, so that way if something were to get through, the applications would only be able to damage those folders and not go out and lock an entire system or get to network drives and things like that. One thing of note is that prior to Windows 10, this was a feature that was only available on the enterprise versions of Windows, but with Windows 10, Microsoft has made that available to Windows Professional as well. So now we're going to talk a little about detection. So despite your best efforts, you've still managed to have a ransomware infection hit your systems. Ideally, you would want to know about this immediately so that you can act. But modern ransomware typically tries to obscure its infection as much as possible. Many of these days will actually leave behind documents with instructions to follow to regain access to your files so the users don't get any kind of pop-up notifying them immediately, and sometimes it could be several days before the users find out. Depending on your backup strategy, that could be catastrophic. If you're only keeping 1 week's worth of backups and users don't know for a week until they've been, that their network drives have been locked, that could be business ending. So having tools in place to catch this kind of activity is pretty important. One good tool to use for that is called Microsoft FSRM. It's File System Resource Manager. It's a role that can be installed on any Windows server using version 2008 and later. And you set up things called file groups, which will monitor for specific types of files being written to network shares. You can have this set in an audit mode that only monitors for these files and alerts administrators if it sees these types of files being written, or you can have it configured to actually block users from accessing file shares if it sees these types of files. So a lot of the common extensions that we see being used for these notifications and for the encryption files themselves, you can monitor for those, and if it sees them, you can block access and alert people. That way you can potentially stop an infection from spreading much larger than it could be. One change to this is that, which again shows the speed at which they're evolving these things, we're starting to see randomized file types being used, so you can't have static lists that monitor for these things. So far that's been relatively limited, but it is an evolution, and probably one day will be common to the point that a solution like this won't work. But for now, it is still a good option, and if you're using Windows Server, it's one that doesn't cost you anything additional to implement. Another nice side effect about this is that the IT community in general has come together to create lists with these patterns and extensions to make it much easier to deploy these things. So they will monitor and see, if they see common new attacks coming out that are using these file types, they'll update these lists, and you can have it set to automatically update your file groups. So that way you don't have to manually manage this, on a daily, weekly basis. It will kind of keep it up to date for you. Another method for detection is behavior analysis. This ties back into some of the things I mentioned with the newer antivirus software packages that we're seeing. And these are, again, monitoring the behavior of programs on the system. There's quite a few programs out there, and I'm sure over time we're going to see many programs, antivirus programs, come out that do this. But again, monitoring the behavior of the processes on a system, and if it sees something suspicious, it can alert administrators. That way you can potentially mitigate an attack before it spreads too far. And lastly, hope someone notices. This should be the method that you don't employ, because again, oftentimes it just doesn't work. Sometimes users will copy files to their local system to work on them, and they might not notice that that an infection has spread to network drives. So hoping someone notices is definitely not a good option, but it's an option that unfortunately many people do employ. So lastly, we're going to talk about remediation. You've taken steps to prevent ransomware, yet something still got through. You had systems in place to monitor suspicious activity, and they did their job, but now you must deal with restoring access to files that have been encrypted. So what are your options? First up would be backups. I thought about spelling out backups several times just to get the point home, but backups really are your last line of defense in these situations. There are lots of industry recommendations and best practices in regards to backups, but there is no one-size-fits-all option. You can spend as much or as little as you want to build a backup solution for your business, but what's important is knowing that what you have is actually regularly tested so that you know that it's working for you. Your backup software can tell you that you have successful backups for years, but if they've never been tested, then you have no way to know for sure and no way to know that your data is actually viable for recovery. This applies to both servers and workstations, because if you have users that are storing company documents locally on their system, the impact on a user's workstation could be just as severe as an infected server. Lastly, pay the ransom. This is always an option and should really be considered the last option. So far, ransomware has typically been something that would be considered affordable, and oftentimes it would be significantly cheaper than putting the things in place to prevent ransomware. And that shouldn't be taken as a way to just, we'll stuff a few $1,000s aside and save it just in case this happens, because we are starting to see signs of ransomware that doesn't demand money. And if you're expecting to be able to pay the ransomware, you're basically betting that thieves are going to be honest, and that once you pay the money that they will send you their encryption key. It's always possible that internet problems could prevent that from happening, or the person who deployed the ransomware could just decide to sleep in that day, and they don't see that you've paid it to stop the timer on your encryption and get you the key in time before it expires. So again, not a particularly great option, but certainly a last line of defense if it comes to that. And if you have no other options, it's really your only option. So we'll talk a little bit about how we can help. So the big thing there is prevention, planning, and testing. And Abel Solutions can help with all of these. We can help provide the tools to prevent a potential attack. We can deploy or assist you in deploying these tools in your environment. We can work with you to create a plan for remediating an attack if something does get through. And lastly, we can help in testing that plan to ensure that it will work for you when it's needed. Now, regardless of the methods used, Abel Solutions will work with you to provide a layered approach to dealing with ransomware and other threats, and arm your company with resources it needs to be secure. All right, now we'll do a quick Q&A, see if we've got a few questions here. So what products would you suggest to use to prevent ransomware? Well, again, this is it changes daily. Right now, there are quite a few good products from companies like Sophos, and Kaspersky also has some products. And again, a layered approach is always the best way to go. So having email filtering, DNS filtering, and antivirus things in place on the actual systems and servers to monitor for these is always the best way to go. And the good thing about these is these days these aren't terribly expensive. You're typically looking at a couple of dollars per workstation, for a combination of these things, and that's always a good thing to have. Another question: is it worth paying for these prevention and detection methods over time? Well, that's really something that your business really has to determine. It's just like any risk analysis. You have to determine if it's cheaper for you in the long run to deal with preventing something, or dealing with the potential downtime and loss of business if something does happen. In my opinion, it's always good to head things off before they happen. But it's just like anything. It's just like backups, or just like any investment into technology. You have to determine whether or not you feel it's going to be a good investment for you. And our last question: can ransomware affect SQL servers or Exchange servers? It's a good question. So far to date, we haven't seen anything infect Exchange servers, but we have seen a few variants out there that are infecting MySQL databases, and I'm sure Microsoft SQL isn't far behind. Typically, these are brute force attacking root access to the database, and interestingly enough, they're not really getting in and encrypting the database. They're getting in and pulling the data out of the database, leaving behind a table with information on how to contact the person who executed the attack so that they can restore your data. So this is something we're seeing. It's certainly not as common as general file infections, but it is something that we are seeing more of. Well, thanks for joining this afternoon. That will be the end of the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And again, my name is Jason Castile with Abel Solutions. Thanks for attending.